Hi, I'm Miss Bovey,
And I'm Miss Hardy.
and today our podcast is about the age of revolutions.
So when we talk about our revolutions, our political revolutions, there's a really neat comparison we can make, a different model of viewing these revolutions through. So we use the fever model of revolution brought to us by Crane-Brinton. And so with that, we have a few stages, and it kind of goes through as you would like an illness. So first you have your incubation stage. These are your long-term causes, usually philosophies that really give you the backbone of your revolution. Now, in a sickness, this is the time where you have gotten the virus, but you don't know it yet. You don't show any symptoms. These are the long-term causes. Next, we have our symptomatic stage. So these are our short-term causes. So what are the immediate causes for a political revolution? Is it a bad harvest? Is it a sudden increase in taxes? What is it? And so in your fever model, if you were sick, the symptomatic stage would be when you're starting to cough, you're starting to sneeze, you're starting to feel achy. And then we have our crisis stage. Now, when you're sick, this is either you get better or you don't. And in our revolutions, these are really the height of the revolution. So what's characteristic of the main events of the revolution? And at this point, it's either you revolt and you succeed, or you revolt and you don't succeed, and that revolution dies. And then our last part of the fever model is this convalescent stage, so kind of the healing part. So this includes both our short and long-term effects of the revolution. And so with our revolutions, you might see these, but the convalescent stage seen in constitutions, or even perhaps inspiring future revolutions.
So now, using that model, let's look at our incubation stage for this age of revolutions and our long-term causes of revolutions. So back up a little bit and know that at the tail end of the early modern period and the beginning of this period that we're studying, we have a series of colonial wars that will break out between Britain and most of the European countries, actually, and the wars will take place on various national stages. They'll take place in North America, they'll take place in Europe, they'll take place in India and the Indian Ocean area down there as these colonial powers war with each other. And so the biggest, most relevant one that we want to focus on will be the 7 Years' War that really is also known as the French and Indian War in the United States or in America. And the other issue we want to look at, and that was the topic of our previous podcast, was the impact of the Age of Enlightenment. These are the theories of John Locke and the idea that we have natural rights, Rousseau's social contract, and that if we're unhappy with our government, that we have the ability to change that government. And so these ideas are already blending. We have struggles between colonial powers and their mother countries, and now this is what's sort of happening that leads us into our age of revolution.
So when we look at this, we're going to do the whole model, the whole fever model with the American Revolution. This is something most of you are already familiar with from prior study. And so we're just going to briefly talk about this with the American Revolution before we move on to our French Revolution. So for the American Revolution, the incubation stage really has to do with, one, the Enlightenment. That's going to be a commonality in all of our revolutions we'll speak about. And then the second is their relative autonomy before the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. Great Britain at that point had given the colonies a large degree of self-rule. And once they come in after the French and Indian War / the 7 Years' War and start requiring the colonists to pay some taxes in order to alleviate some of that war debt in Great Britain, that's when the American colonists start getting will have a lot of tension with Great Britain, really questioning why they have the right to tax them if they're not being politically represented in Parliament.
So the phrase "no taxation without representation" gets thrown about during this period as sort of the rallying cry to this issue because, well, the next stage after this incubation will be the implementation of a series of different acts that Britain will force on the American colonies. And that's when that question, like, why are we being taxed if we have no representation in the British Parliament? Because they view themselves as British citizens and are happy to be British citizens, but they want the government representation that's not happening.
So if there was a hashtag for the American Revolution, that's where you would see hashtag no taxation without representation. If it doesn't rhyme, it's just not good. And so our symptomatic stage, these are our short-term causes, mostly brought about by the Tax Act. So you'll see these in things like stamp, which was really a tax on all paper products. A good comparison I've always heard is, what if suddenly you had to pay a tax every time you logged on to Wi-Fi? That really denotes the seriousness of the Stamp Act in terms of how many paper products they use that were being taxed. And so you have that, you have the Intolerable Acts.
You have the sugar tax,
Mhm.
you have the tea tax, you have taxes all on so many different things, and they just sort of continue to ratchet it up. And some taxes they will repeal because of the amount of boycotting and anger that the colonists will make, but as a whole, you'll just see this cycle of unending taxes that get launched on the colonists.
Absolutely. So some of the symptomatic stages that we'll see the Boston Tea Party. We'll see the Boston Massacre, which was, of course, a good piece of propaganda for the colonists to throw about.
The colonists totally manipulate that circumstance in their favor, even though, let's be honest, they're the ones that riled up the British soldiers into firing on them in the first place.
But once you see that there's a poor puppy dog being shot upon,
Right.
Suddenly the British are no good. So our crisis stage are our big characteristics of the American Revolution. We have the Continental Congress, where they do declare themselves, they meet to declare themselves independent. We have the first battles at Lexington and Concord. We have the turning point at Saratoga, which that victory allowed the French to move in because they felt like the Americans weren't a total lost cause. And let's face it, anything France could do to antagonize Britain or to make Britain lose any power, they were going to do, even at the demise of their own national treasury.
Well, and it's important to note as well is that without outside help, the American Revolution would not have been successful.
Right.
Because the British were the most militarily advanced society in the world at that time, the most advanced generals. So the fact that the French will help, that the Americans are able to bring in German commanders to help sort of train their troops, and they get additional aid from Spain in addition, that those things help sort of turn the tide in favor of the American colonists.
And we see that tide at the Battle of Yorktown. So really the final battle that creates America's victory, their final, Declaration of Independence is complete at the Battle of Yorktown. And then the convalescent stage, so that healing stage, we usually look at this in terms of government articles. So we have the first, the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution. We have the first form of government, the Articles of Confederation, and you all know that it was very weak and it did not work well with the states providing.
And so they come back, relook at the
Yes.
Articles of Confederation, and end up throwing them entirely away, creating the Constitution and the Bill of Rights being the first 10 amendments to that document,
So
which of
that
course
would be
becomes
ratified.
absolutely very, very significant for the rest of democratic nations that will follow the United States as they adopt constitutions themselves.
Exactly. And when we look at the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that's where we see so much of the Enlightenment thought placed in there. Same with the Declaration of Independence. But the reason why our government documents are so precious is because it's really our first enlightened government that succeeded. So it's the Constitution is an enlightened government system along with the Bill of Rights that has lasted since its inception.
Yeah,
It's
the
pretty
longest,
incredible.
at any nation in the world. And you'll see the elements of the Baron de Montesquieu. We talked about him in our previous podcast, the separation of powers with the judicial, executive, and legislative branches.
We also see the influence of Voltaire during this time in the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment brings in the freedom of speech and religion that Voltaire espoused in his writings, his satirical writings as well.
So the American Revolution is really significant simply because it helps feed into the French Revolution. And the slogan of the French Revolution was Liberté, Égalité, and Fraternité. I'm saying French totally wrong, but liberty, equality, and fraternity is the idea behind this.
So the French Revolution itself is fascinating. And so its causes are very interesting. So you have a similarity with the American Revolution in that they are both caused by the Enlightenment, even more so in France because many of the philosophes were in France. Second, we have a severe financial crisis because, well, one, Louis gave too much money to the American Revolution. Louis XVI gave too much money in assistance, really depleting their national treasury, and that depletion was really started by his grandfather, Louis XIV, with his absolutist ways. Second, we have a lot of population growth and we have really bad harvests. And so there's no food and the government has no more money. And so how they're going to raise more money is going to be to raise taxes. And that brings us to the primary cause of the French Revolution, which is the inequality among the different estates. So in the Estates General, we have three different estates. The first one is the clergy, so the Catholic Church. Second one is all of your nobility. And then the third is the bourgeoisie. The third, really peasants, wealthy merchants, just people without titles, kind of the middle class, and the peasants. And so each of the estates only gets one vote on any law that is passed. And so often what would happen is the clergy and the nobility would team up in their vote and make it a 2-to-1 vote against the third estate, so that the third estate always held really the tax burden of all of France. And when you couple this with no food and no money, and they have to raise a new tax in order to supplement the lavish lifestyles of the king and the nobles, that's a recipe for disaster or a recipe for revolution.
Absolutely. And the other thing I want to point out is that the percentage of the population that fit into these three estates, I mean, the bourgeoisie really do make up like 97% of the people. And so the fact that the burden of everything falls on their shoulder is there, and they have the least money, right? All of the money is held in the first two classes, not the third class. And so, like Miss Hardy said, with the bad harvest, and to put it in perspective, the French relied heavily on bread. In fact, I would say the bulk of their diet was that one food item. Most people ate about 2 pounds of bread a day. And so when your grain crop dies multiple years in a row, there just literally is no more bread, no more flour to make bread. And so the peasants begin to starve. And when mass peasants begin to starve, well, then they're going to also revolt.
We'll see this all the time in history. If there's a bad famine, there is a revolt. In fact, many times empires their falls are partially caused by peasant revolts due to them not having food. So the Estates General, so they have all of this unrest. And so Louis XVI decides to summon the Estates General. They hadn't been called since Louis XIV disbanded them.
More than 150 years earlier.
Right. And so with this, the Estates General is called. Their whole thing was to get a new tax voted upon, and it was supposed to fall on the nobles. And yet, once again, the clergy in the first estate and the nobility in the second estate vote that tax down and instead try to put it on the third estate. And this is the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back, because the third estate gets so angry, and they're all riled up with one being having no food, and two, all these Enlightenment ideals about how to reform your government if they're not basing their law of what the people need. And so they rise up and they just go next door and they're like, we are now the governing body of France. We're going to create our own assembly called the National Assembly, and we will fix France, and we will decide who has taxes placed upon them. Well, Louis XVI is not so happy about this. And so during one of their breaks, he goes and locks the room door. I kid you not, like locks the door, because he really thought if they couldn't meet in that room,
then they couldn't actually go forward with their plans.
Now, unlucky for him, they had this at the Palace of Versailles, which is known for having many a different room. And so the National Assembly just go to an indoor tennis court and say, look, we're not leaving this tennis court until we've created really a new constitution for France. And that's the tennis court oath that they create, which you've seen in modern days with the Lord's famous song, Tennis Court. Hey-o.
Hey-o. All right, so things start to move ahead with this sort of instance. Now, of course, you do have a group of moderates that exist within the government. The very famous Marquis de Lafayette that made his fame with his relationship with General Washington and support of the United States during the American Revolution is trying to help create essentially a constitutional monarchy. And the National Assembly begins meeting in Paris on a regular basis to establish this, but angry crowds still exist within the city.
Yes.
And they decide that they're going to go raid the Bastille, which is like this huge prison that is sort of the symbol of everything that is wrong, the abuses of the monarchy, the corruption of the aristocracy, and, well, let's be honest, that's the only place where there's any, like, weapons and gunpowder and things like that. So they storm the Bastille, like, murder the guy that's in charge of the Bastille. They put his head on a pike.
On a pike!
Which will then become sort of the symbol of the revolution, chopping off people's heads and throwing them on pikes. And this will actually, this takes place on July 14th, 1789, which is known as French Independence Day to this day, this rebellion that takes place at the Bastille.
And what's interesting about this is really the harmful nature of rumors and the French Revolution. So this is a theme we'll see throughout of if there's an inkling of truth or really just the idea of something happening, people rally around it. So they really heard that Louis XVI was bringing a military in to squash the National Assembly so he can be an absolute monarch. That wasn't true. I mean, to be fair, he was moving troops in, but not to dispel the National Assembly. It was really to deal with the fact that we have so many hangry presidents trying to revolt. And so that one little rumor is like, we must arm ourselves. We must rise up against this absolutist power. And that's when they storm, and my American accent, the Bastille. The correct way is the Bastille. All those letters the French don't even use. And then this leads to more peasant revolts all throughout France. A lot of peasants in the countryside will start creating their own militias, and now Louis XVI has a huge problem. And so in this National Assembly, what they're really trying to accomplish is that new constitution. And we see that with Dormac, or the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It's a beautiful document. And in this, we abolish the nobility, so the idea of hereditary privileges. They do create a constitutional monarchy, and then they separate church and state. So they say that the church no longer can have a voice in government, and they kind of kick them out of the Estates General.
So a series of additional rebellions and turmoils continue to erupt. As you can imagine, Louis and Marie have been in Versailles this whole time period, for the most part, ignoring the general unrest that the peasantry is dealing with, because for themselves, they're not starving, their lifestyle hasn't changed. Another issue is the fact that Marie Antoinette, King Louis's wife, is known for expending a lot of money and having lavish parties and doing ridiculous things that the citizenry just does not appreciate at all.
Well, and she's this foreign princess that is of little substance to them and just goes out in these ridiculously, I mean, at one point she had a boat in her hair as part of this updo. I mean, just unnecessarily extravagant while the rest of the nation is hungry and they're really suffering. And yet here she is in her fancy dresses. Oh.
And so a group of fish women, I think they're known as Pugnards, I could be saying that incorrectly, decide that they themselves are going to march out to Versailles. So they're going to walk about the 17 miles from Paris to the Palace of Versailles to basically kill Louis and Marie. And in fact, by the time they get to Versailles, Marie finds out right at the moment that they're storming the palace and manages to escape out of another room as they shred her bedroom. And basically they're captured as prisoners and taken back to Paris, basically held in prison because they want to keep control over them. At least the people want to keep control over them because they don't trust what they're going to do as far as running the country.
Now, Marie Antoinette's family kind of creates this escape plan for them. And so they try to escape to Marie Antoinette's homeland in Austria. However, I mean, they are so close. They wear their disguises, they have children, and they're trying to get out. And they're about a day's journey away when they're discovered.
But let's be honest, when you're driving in a carriage that can seat 18, that is not inconspicuous.
No, and that's really, if you need to escape, don't go in a Lamborghini. Just
take a Toyota.
Take a Camry, right? It'll be fine. So with this, they find them and they bring them back. And this is really where we start to see the rise of the more radical, thank you, the radical rise of the people in the National Assembly. And so they hold this trial, if you could call it that, and declare that Louis and his wife were traitors and that they were going to Austria to try and come back with a military, an army to suppress the people's revolt. And so they find him guilty, and then they sentence him to death via the guillotine. Now, fun fact on the guillotine, which, I mean, if my last name was Guillotine and I had a death machine named after me, I might not be so happy. But it was one of these enlightened, really death sentences because they felt it was painless. I know what you're thinking.
And they were trying to have equality in death. That
right.
Everyone, if they all died through this method, not being hung or having your head chopped off, like with an executioner, that the one blade, it brings equality to the citizenry, and that is the most noble way to die, equal. And so King Louis really becomes one of the first people to be executed using this new execution method, and right in front of the public, he dies.
And then they use his head. I mean, you see on the screen the poster of them holding Louis's head as it's dripping its final things of blood. And so they execute him. And so with that, we see the loss of all real sanity with the idea and hope of having a constitutional monarchy like England had created. And now we're going to move into something a little bit more extreme, the Reign of Terror. You have to give it up to historians on this part. This was a good job in naming a time period in history, the Reign of Terror.
So it's important to note that you have Maximilien Robespierre as sort of the director of the National Assembly. And really, it's his brainchild that launches the Reign of Terror. And the Reign of Terror, what's the basic premise behind it, Ms. Hardy?
So this Reign of Terror is a time period where suddenly the revolution kind of cannibalizes. It turns on its own. And so now if you don't like the radical nature of whatever Robespierre and his directory are wanting to do, you're killed. You're killed by the guillotine. At the height of the Reign of Terror, you had 40,000 people killed. And so during this really short period of time, anyone who whispered anything negative against what the Jacobins and Robespierre was doing, they were killed.
So you mean if I was complaining about the price of bread, I could die?
Dead.
Crazy.
Crazy. In fact, they had people that would literally knit hit lists into scarves to be the kind of eyes and ears of the directory. And if they heard people complain, they had spies all over the city. And once you were accused,
you died.
You died. Like, there was no idea of a fair trial. I mean, they had a trial, but if it was not a trial, if you were accused, there was no way to prove yourself innocent, which is really interesting with the whole ideals of the Enlightenment now being taken to the extreme.
So one of my most famous paintings of this time period, which we don't have in this particular slide, is of the death of Marat. And Marat ran sort of like the main newspaper that was supporting this reign of terror and this radical idea, and anything that he published, and he helped sort of fuel the rumors and all of the lies that sort of existed during this time period. And so this woman by the name of Charlotte Corday decides that if he dies, because he's so horrible to this whole process, that he's just kind of evil, that if he dies, the revolution will die with it, or at least this reign of terror period will die, because he'll stop publishing all those names. And so she sneaks in under guise that she has names that he can publish in his newspaper. And he had an ailment, which meant that he spent most of his days lying in a bathtub. And she kills him while he's in the bathtub.
Stabs him.
She's successful, but in the sense that he dies, unsuccessful in the fact that he becomes a martyr for the cause.
So while this reign of terror is occurring, it's not just isolated in Paris that they're having this revolution, but France is also at war with a lot of major European nations, because these European monarchs who are also absolutists are really afraid that if France is successful, then that might inspire revolutions in their own countries. So while France is kind of cannibalizing itself in the reign of terror inside of Paris, they're also at war with a lot of European nations. And so you see mass conscription of men. And we also see the rise of a new kind of up-and-coming military leader whose name is Napoleon Bonaparte, who will later be important as one of the figures that ends the French Revolution.
So ultimately, the Reign of Terror, because Ms. Hardy's been talking about the fact that it will cannibalize itself, Maximilien Robespierre goes in front of the directory and says, I have a list of names of people that are in this room that I'm going to publish that are all traitors to the thing. And everyone's like, what?
All the moderates are now thinking, maybe it's gone too far.
And so instead they decide maybe he should be rounded up and assassinated. Not assassinated, but killed as well, because he's sort of taking this thing too far. And he finds out, he's arrested, and the night before he's supposed to go to the guillotine, he attempts suicide, shoots himself in the jaw, and shatters it, doesn't die. The man who was the mouthpiece for the revolution is now rendered speechless as they mock him shamelessly the next day, and they lay his body out on a table, and guess what? He's still.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, also during this time, Robespierre goes a little crazy. Not like he wasn't crazy before, but he starts his own cult.
Yes.
and has these ceremonies.
Like the cult of the goddess of wisdom or
It's
something like that.
very
He wears
strange.
like Greek robes and gets rid of like anything that might relate to the Catholic Church in any way. So you can't have Sunday because people might worship on Sunday. So now the days of the week, there's 10 days and
like a totally different calendar. They're like, oh, Gregorian calendars, those are so absolute modern. Like that's so last year. And they, take all of the cathedrals and turn them into houses of reason, and they rid it of church influence. And so, I mean, at this point, with his own cult being created, he's executed.
Yeah.
Along with his, most fervent followers.
like I said, the man goes a little nuts.
A little nuts.
Power went to his head.
It did, and then he lost it. So,
And after
poetic
he
justice.
dies, really, like, everything sort of slows down at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at the impact of the French Revolution. Really, the idea is that they challenged the divine right. So the absolute monarch king is removed. And this is the final death blow for feudalism in France because the peasants don't want the system because they now have eliminated the nobility class with the creation of their new declaration.
Right. And then the other thing is that this middle class, the bourgeoisie, are going to be the ones with the political power. No more is it going to be held in the hands of the religious and political elite with the nobility. But now truly we have a middle class of men who are educated who have now the political power. And then the other thing, the impact of both the French Revolution and the American Revolution is that they'll serve as models for both the Haitian and Latin American revolutions that we'll speak on later. And then finally, we have the rise of one of the most interesting leaders in European history, Napoleon, who'll kind of come in and kind of change Europe in and of itself.
Absolutely. All right. So who is Napoleon? Napoleon, well, is not actually French. Grew up in Corsica, which is an island off France, and at a young age went to military academy and was very bottom of his class. I think out of like 60 people, he was 56th. So don't think that you have to be number one to be successful, because he was wildly successful, but not the smartest branch on the tree.
So now you have something a little bit more classy than Drake, started from the bottom, now we're here. You have Napoleon, started off in Corsica, now I'm emperor.
But it's during the French Revolution that he sort of sets himself apart for his military mind and his brilliance, and helps with some key battles. With some key battles in the Revolution, and manages to rise up from just a basic foot soldier and getting some actual positions.
So when Robespierre dies and they have to form this new government, they also take off of Republic Rome and the idea of consuls. And so they have these 3 consuls, in of which Napoleon, you can see at that bottom row, the one next to him as emperor, is him as consul. And he kind of decides like, no, I'm not going to be one of the 3. I will be first consul. And then he decides, not enough, I'm going to be emperor. You can see his image on the bottom right. Just the amount of pomp and circumstance around Napoleon. And I will take this moment to dispel a rumor. There's always a rumor that Napoleon was very short.
I know.
That he was 5'2", he'd always says. He was only 5'2", such a shorty. Now, this is before weights and measurements had been standardized in France and England. And so the French inch and the British inch were different. And so though the British will call Napoleon 5'2", he's actually, in our terms, about 5'7", which for that time was taller than average. So it is a misconception that Napoleon was short. He was tall for his time. Good for him.
So Napoleon essentially seizes power in a military coup, and there isn't a lot of resistance to him. For the most part, he is wildly accepted. The people love him.
Oh, yes.
And the picture that you see there on the screen of him all gussied up in his robes is that he actually, like, crowns himself emperor.
He does.
He takes the crown from the Pope's hands because essentially it's his symbolic sign that I am seizing power, no one's giving it to me.
Correct. And so when we look at this, Napoleon does a lot of really great things.
Yeah.
I mean, he tries to take over all of Europe, but he does some really great things. Like, he starts the park system in Paris. So even when you go to Paris Day, if you go to Paris Day, you usually go and you walk around the parks. He started that. He also creates his own law code, the Napoleonic Law Code, which is the basis of European law code today, which goes to another theme of history. If it's really good, you name it after yourself. Hammurabi named it after himself. Justinian named it after himself. Napoleon named it after himself.
It's a good rule of thumb.
Good rule of thumb. And so with this, he'll start to expand, he'll start to conquer most of continental Europe. And so as he goes in, he brings a lot of the French reforms. So he makes all citizens equal. He imposes religious toleration. He abolishes feudalism in every country that he conquers. And then he also puts his family members then on the thrones in order to secure the strength of his empire, which good for him.
Makes sense.
It makes sense. And so he brings them these Enlightenment reforms. Now, what's interesting is that he'll actually end up bringing the rise of nationalism to a lot of these European states, because all of a sudden, now that they've been conquered by this French emperor, all of a sudden they think, but we're not French. And we start to see the accumulation of people identifying themselves by their nation, and really, we're Italian, we're German, we're Spanish. And so even though he conquers and brings some good things, we'll see the rise of nationalism because these people in Europe don't want a French emperor to be their emperor.
Well, one of his biggest skills, his ability to successfully conquer other regions, will also be his biggest downfall as well. Because it costs so much to perpetually be at war with other countries, this is why the United States is able to seize up the Louisiana Purchase at a phenomenal rate, because Napoleon just needs cash, to be honest with you, and so they're willing to let go of what is actually prime real estate to President Jefferson. But Napoleon has his sights set on the big kahuna, the largest land grab possible in Europe, and that is Russia. And his decision to go in and to attack Russia will be his biggest downfall.
So Russia has this strategy. They've used it more than once, which is when anyone invades you, you draw them in as far as you can. Now, Napoleon went in their summer breeches, right? So they're capri pants. And so they're going into Russia thinking, easy breezy, we'll take them over. We haven't lost so far, but Russia draws them in. So they just keep retreating and taking all the animals and burning the land. Like, you can't have anything.
And the farther they get inland, the colder the weather starts to become.
I don't know if you've heard about Russian winters, but they're not lovely.
They aren't. And the Russians know how to deal with their own weather. But Napoleon and his troops, now put it in perspective, he has about 600,000 troops made up of soldiers from all the countries that he has conquered up to this point. After that fateful winter, when they really do very little damage to the Russians and they eventually have to retreat because they are just freezing to death and starving to death, when he gets home, he will have lost more than 500,000 people.
Whoa.
That's a big loss. And most of those are not because of military combat. They're because of starvation and freezing. Literally, his soldiers would freeze to death on the march back.
They would start using their horses and carving them out Star Wars style to go inside of them to stay warm.
In fact, they would cut off flesh from the horses as the horses were walking to try to eat. Literally, like just cutting off flanks from them. And the horses, it would freeze instantly. The blood, it would just sort of cauterize itself. I mean, it was terrible. It was downright terrible.
So I hope we've left you with a good mental image of why it's never a good idea to invade Russia during the winter, unless you're the Mongols.
Yes, because guess what? Hitler tries the same strategy, and the Russians do the same thing, and Hitler is wildly unsuccessful as well.
Then Stalingrad happens, and Hitler loses. So we have that with Napoleon Bonaparte. He does not do well. So after he comes back, this is the rest of Europe's time to seize Napoleon. And so they do. He'll meet his demise at the Battle of Waterloo. And this comes to an interesting little story of Napoleon and his inability to lose. So initially, when Napoleon first loses, they set him off on this nice little island retirement in the Mediterranean. But he escapes, comes back through Italy, amasses another army, and he goes on this rampage in Europe for another 100 days before the Europeans are able to reconquer him. And this time they throw him off to an island off the west coast of Africa, and they're like, good luck getting out of here,
You
buddy.
were never leaving again.
Yeah.
So there he actually, after about 5 years, he dies. But to put it in perspective, like, French people today still absolutely adore Napoleon. And one of the largest mausoleums to any leader I have ever seen, and I have traveled to lots of countries, is the coffin monument to Napoleon that is in Paris. And if you ever go to Paris, you should go check out where he is buried, because it is massive, this massive monument to himself. that the French people have, bestowed upon him
Oh,
because they
yeah.
loved who he was.
So that's all we have for you today. We've talked about the American Revolution, we've talked about the French Revolution. Next time we're going to talk to you about the impacts of both of these revolutions in the Haitian and Latin American revolutions, and then in the rise of the isms. So we're going to talk about nationalism, romanticism. We're going to see a lot of different movements, and so we hope to see you next time.
In our podcast. Thanks.
Bye.